My father kept one room locked for 25 years and refused to tell anyone why. 3 weeks after his death, I finally opened the door and understood everything. My name is James Callum. I am 31 years old, and 3 weeks after my father died, I finally opened the room he had kept locked for my entire life. Before I tell you what was inside, hit like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I always love knowing where you're listening from. Now, let me take you back because this story doesn't start with a locked door. It starts with the man who kept it locked. And you need to understand him before any of the rest of this makes sense. My father's name was Thomas Callum. He was a quiet man in the way that certain men are quiet, not because they have nothing to say, but because they have decided carefully what is worth saying and what isn't. He worked as a civil engineer for 33 years. Roads, bridges, water systems. The kind of infrastructure that nobody notices until it stops working. He used to say that was the best compliment his work could receive, that no one was talking about it, that it just worked. He raised me alone from the time I was 6 years old. My mother left in the spring of that year. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I did for a long time. But I've come to understand that some people are not built for the life they find themselves in, and leaving is the most honest thing they can do. My mother was one of those people. She sent cards at Christmas for a few years, then she didn't. It was just my father and me in that house for 25 years. The house was a 2-story colonial on a street with old oak trees that dropped leaves in a way my father called excessive and rad anyway, every Saturday without complaint. 3 bedrooms upstairs, a study on the main floor, a kitchen that was too big for 2 people, and that my father filled with the smell of coffee every morning at 5:45 without exception. The locked room was at the end of the upstairs hallway. I noticed it when I was young, the way children notice things that don't quite fit. The other doors in the house opened freely. This one had a deadbolt, the kind you need a key for, installed above the regular handle. The wood around it was older than the rest of the door frame, like it had been added later, retrofitted into a door that wasn't originally meant to be secured that way. I asked my father about it when I was 7. He was at the kitchen table with his coffee and his newspaper, the actual paper kind, which he read every morning from front to back before he said much of anything. He looked up when I asked. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "That room is mine. You'll understand when you're older." I said, "What's in it?" He said, "Things that belong to me." He wasn't unkind about it. He wasn't secretive in a way that felt alarming. He was simply clear. The room was his. That was the answer. The conversation ended and he went back to his newspaper and I went back to whatever 7-year-olds go back to, and the room stayed locked. I asked again at 9:00. He said the same thing with the same calm. I asked at 12 and he said, "James, when I'm ready, you'll know. Until then, let it be." I let it be. That is not to say I stopped thinking about it. Children do not stop thinking about locked doors just because they've been told not to. I pressed my ear against the wood once when I was 10 and heard nothing. I tried to look through the keyhole and saw only darkness. I checked once for a spare key in the obvious places, the kitchen junk drawer, the hook by the back door, the little ceramic bowl on the entryway table where my father kept coins and receipts. I found nothing. I eventually stopped looking. Not because I stopped wondering, because I grew up and other things took my attention, and the room became one of those features of childhood that you absorb into your understanding of normal. Our house had a locked room. That was just true. Like the oak trees dropped too many leaves and my father read the paper front to back before he spoke. It was just part of how things were. My father was a good man to grow up with. I want to say that clearly because this story has a mystery in it, and I don't want the mystery to color your understanding of him. He was not a damaged man hiding something shameful. He was not absent or cold or difficult in the ways some fathers are. He came to every game I played, both the ones I was good at and the many more I wasn't. He helped with homework in the patient-specific way of someone who understands that the goal is not to give answers, but to teach someone how to find them. He cooked dinner every night. Nothing elaborate practical food made well. And we sat at the kitchen table together and talked about the day. He talked about his work in ways that made infrastructure sound genuinely interesting, which I only realized was a skill much later. He asked about my friends by name and remembered the details from week to week. He showed up. He was not a man who said I love you easily or often, but he showed up, and I understood early and completely that in his language showing up was the same thing. I left for college at 18 State University engineering program, which should not surprise anyone. I came home every few months and every summer for the first 2 years, and then less often as the life I was building elsewhere became more solid and required more of my attention. The room was always locked when I came home. I stopped registering it consciously the way you stop registering furniture you've walked past 10,000 times. My father retired at 66. I was 29. I drove back for the small dinner he allowed me to arrange, just the two of us, and his neighbor Harold, who had lived next door for 20 years, and who my father trusted in the quiet way he trusted everything, slowly and completely. At dinner, my father seemed the same as always, steady, specific in his conversation, interested in my work in a way that was never performative. He asked about a bridge rehabilitation project I was working on, and listened carefully to the answer, and then said something about load distribution that was better than anything my supervisor had said about it. 3 months after he retired, he called me on a Tuesday evening. He said, "James, I need you to come home this weekend." I said, "Is everything okay?" He said, "Everything is fine. I just need you to come home." When I arrived Friday evening, he had made dinner, pot roast, the same one he had made on significant occasions my whole life. Birthdays the night before I left for college. The weekend I got my first real job offer. I sat down across from him at the kitchen table and understood without being told that something was going to be said. We ate. We talked about Harold's knee surgery and the oak trees losing a large branch in a storm the week before. My father refilled my water glass without asking. Then he folded his hands on the table and looked at me. He said, "I want to tell you about the room." I put down my fork. He said, "I've been thinking for a long time about when the right moment was, and I've decided there isn't a right moment. There's just a moment when you're finally willing to do it. And I'm willing." I said, "Okay." He was quiet for a moment. Then he began, "Your mother and I were happy once." He said, "I want you to know that first because I think you've always wondered and I should have told you sooner. We were happy. She was not a bad person who did a bad thing. She was a person who wanted a life that was different from the one we had built. And she stayed longer than she should have trying to want what we had. And by the time she left, we were both exhausted in ways that were hard to come back from." I said, "I know. Dad." He said, "Let me finish." He told me that before my mother left, before things had gotten to the point they got to. There had been a period of about 2 years that he called the good years. Not the early years when everything was new and easy, but a specific window. I would have been about 3 and 4 years old, when something had settled between my parents into something he described as genuinely good. Sunday mornings, weekend trips to places that weren't far away but felt like they were, a garden they kept together. Which surprised me because my father had never kept a garden in the years I could remember. He said those 2 years had been the best of his life. And then things changed, and then she left. And then it was just the two of us. He said the room was hers. It was going to be a studio. She painted, not professionally, not with any ambition about it, just because it made her happy. We cleared it out and put good light in it, and she was going to make it hers. He stopped. She left before she ever really used it. He said, "And I couldn't go in there after. I tried once about a year after she left, and I walked in and stood there for a few minutes. And then I walked back out, and I put the lock on the door, and I didn't go back." I said, "For 25 years. He looked at me steadily. "For 25 years. I said, Dad, he said, I know, but I want you to understand something. I wasn't broken by it. I wasn't sitting in this house grieving every day. I built a life. I raised you. I did my work. The room was just something I wasn't ready to open. And because I didn't need to open it, there was no reason compelling enough until now. I said, What changed? He picked up his water glass. He set it down without drinking. He said, I'm 66 years old and I retired last quarter, and I have more time now than I know what to do with. And I've started to understand that time at the end of a life is different from time in the middle of it. In the middle of a life, you can leave things for later. At the end, you start to understand that later is a shorter word than you thought it was. We sat with that for a moment. Then he said, I'd like to open it together this weekend if you're willing. I said, Of course I'm willing. He nodded. He refilled my water glass again. We finished dinner and washed up and watched something on television that neither of us was really watching and went to bed. Saturday morning. Coffee at 5:45. He made eggs. We sat at the kitchen table and read him with his paper. Me with my phone, the way we always had when I was home, comfortable in the particular silence that belongs to people who have known each other long enough to not need to fill it. After breakfast, he said, Ready. He led me upstairs, down the hallway, past my old room, past the bathroom, to the end where the locked door had always been. He reached into his shirt pocket and took out a key. Old brass, worn smooth at the edges from being held, which told me he had held it many times, even if he had never used it. He put the key in the lock. He paused with his hand on the key. Then he turned it. The door opened on a room that smelled like time, dust, and something faint beneath it. Something that took me a moment to identify. Paint. Old paint. The specific dry smell of paint that has been sitting on a pallet or in tubes for a very long time without being opened. The room was not empty. There was an easel in the corner near the window, collapsed and leaning against the wall. There was a wooden table along one side with a surface stained in a dozen colors, blues and greens, and a streak of deep red that had dried into the grain of the wood long ago. There were jars with dried brushes in them. There was a wooden stool. There was a small bookshelf with art books, color theory, the history of Impressionism, a field guide to botanical illustration, and there were canvases. They were everywhere, stacked against the walls, some faced inward, some faced outward. There were small ones and large ones. There were some stretched on frames and some rolled carefully and stored in a long flat box on the floor. My father stood in the doorway and looked at the room. I walked in slowly. I turned one of the canvases that was facing the wall. It was a painting of a garden, small and specific, painted in a style that was careful and a little tentative, like someone who was good, but who wasn't sure yet how good. Greens in a dozen shades, a suggestion of sunlight across the top. I turned another. A kitchen table, a coffee cup, morning light through a window. I turned another and my breath stopped. It was me. I was maybe 3 years old in the painting, sitting on the floor with something in my hands, a toy I didn't recognize, painted from above, the angle of someone sitting in a chair watching a child play. The face was not perfectly proportioned the way a professional portrait would be, but the light was right, the way the light fell across my hair, across the floor beside me. The feeling of the thing was completely right. I said, Dad. He said, She painted a lot, that last year especially. I turned another canvas and another. There were more of me asleep, me eating, me in the backyard at some age, I couldn't quite place, reaching towards something outside the frame. And there were paintings that weren't me, landscapes, windows, the oak tree in the front yard that was smaller in the painting than I had ever known it. I counted eventually. There were 41 paintings in that room. I said, Did you know about all of these? He said. Most of them. Some I hadn't seen before today. He came and stood beside me and we looked at them together. He didn't say much. He picked up one of the rolled canvases from the flat box and unrolled it carefully and held it for a moment, and then set it down. I said, "Do you know where she is?" He said, "I have an address. I've had it for a while. I've never written." I said, "Why not?" He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "Because I didn't know what I wanted to say. And I've always believed that if you don't know what you want to say, the honest thing is to say nothing until you do." I said, "And now," he said, "now I think maybe the paintings should go to her. That's what I wanted to tell you. I wanted you to see them first. I wanted you to know they existed, but I think they belong to her." I looked at him. He said, "Even after everything," he said, "they're her work, James. Whatever happened between us doesn't change whose work it is." We spent most of that day in the room. We went through everything carefully. My father told me what he knew about individual paintings, which ones she had worked on longest, which ones she had been frustrated with, the few she had talked about with anything like pride. He told me about the garden from the first painting. It had been in the backyard of the apartment they had before this house before me, and she had loved it more than anything they owned, and had mourned it when they moved. In the late afternoon, I sat on the wooden stool, and my father sat on the floor with his back against the wall, which I had never seen him do, and we stayed in the room as the light changed. He said, "I should have opened it sooner." I said, "You opened it when you were ready." He said, "I kept thinking I needed a reason, something that would make it feel right. But the reason never came. The readiness had to come first." I said, "That sounds like something you should have told me 10 years ago." He almost smiled. Almost. My father died 14 months after that Saturday. A stroke. He was in his study at his desk, which was where he spent most of his retired mornings reading engineering journals and corresponding with former colleagues, and occasionally consulting on projects, because the city kept asking him, and he kept saying yes because he said the work was the only part of retirement that felt like himself. I got the call on a Wednesday afternoon and drove 4 hours, and by the time I arrived, it was over. I sat in his kitchen that night. 5:45 came and went without coffee. The house was completely quiet in a way it had never been before. In the days after, sorting through his things, I found an envelope on his desk, my name on the front in his handwriting, small and precise the way his handwriting always was. Inside was a letter in a smaller envelope. The letter said, "James," in the smaller envelope. "You will find your mother's address and a note I wrote but never sent. I am leaving the decision to you. If you think she should have it, send it. If you think she shouldn't, that is also a reasonable choice, and I trust your judgment. The paintings are boxed and labeled in the locked room, which you should now be able to open with the key on my desk. I had them wrapped properly last spring. Do with them what you think is right. I think you know what I would have wanted." I sat at the kitchen table for a long time with the 2 envelopes in front of me. Then I opened the smaller one. My father's unsent note was 3 paragraphs long. It was not angry. It was not sentimental in the way people are sentimental when they want something. It was clear and specific the way everything my father wrote was clear and specific. He told her that James had grown into someone she would be glad to know, that he worked on infrastructure, bridges and water systems, things that worked quietly in the background of other people's lives, that he had my father's patience and something else that was harder to name, an instinct for what mattered, that my father had always believed came from her. He said the paintings were carefully stored and belonged to her if she wanted them. He said he hoped she had built something good. He did not say he forgave her. He did not say he didn't. He said he hoped she had built something good. That was all. And somehow that was everything. I sent the letter. I don't know if she will respond. I don't know if she will want the paintings. I don't know what I will say if she does respond. What version of myself I will be in that conversation. How much of the 6-year-old who lost her and the 31-year-old who found her. Paintings in a locked room will be present when I finally speak to her, if I ever do. What I know is what I found in that room. 41 paintings. A garden from an apartment she loved. A coffee cup in morning light. A child sitting on a floor with a toy painted from above by someone who was watching carefully, who was paying the specific attention that love pays to ordinary things. My father kept that room locked for 25 years. Not because he was broken by what happened. He told me that himself, and I believed him. He kept it locked because it was the one place in the house that belonged entirely to the time before, to the 2 good years, to the version of his life that could have kept going, but didn't. And he wasn't ready to open it until he understood that the past doesn't need to be resolved to be released. It just needs to be seen. He kept it locked because some things need time. More time than feels reasonable, more time than other people think is necessary. And that is allowed. That is a thing that is allowed. I go back to the house now on weekends. Sometimes I sleep in my old room. I make coffee at 5:45 because the habit transferred without my choosing it. I sit at the kitchen table and I look at the painting I kept. Just one. The one of me as a child on the floor in the light. And I think about a man who kept a locked door in his house for 25 years and still managed to be the most present person I have ever known. He kept one room for himself. He gave everything else to me. I think that was fair. I think that was more than fair. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And if you are new here, I would love for you to subscribe. There are more stories coming.